I'd like to thank everyone for coming today to the Mixed Methods webinar series, co-hosted by the Mixed Methods International Research Association, as well as the University of Alberta International Institute for Qualitative Methodology.
Great, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Tom Lynch, and we're excited to be on this webinar with you, and want to thank Yvette for organizing such a great online presentation opportunity here. And thank you too for those very kind introductions. Just a little bit of more recent background too in some of the work that I've been doing. Yvette had shared that I have been doing work recently at the kind of intersection of software theory and English education. And what you have there on the slides is just sort of a recent example of some of the work that we've been doing here at Pace University around integrating robotics, in this case, kind of the programming of robots with the teaching of Shakespeare. And so, one of the things that we're very interested in, obviously, is this overlap of quantitative and qualitative kind of paradigms. And here's just kind of another sort of riff or example of sort of kind of getting involved in that space where what's traditionally kind of thought of as a very scientific, technological, quantitative world of robotics or programming. What does it mean to put that in tension with and in the service of doing some more kind of humanistic work in something like teaching Shakespeare? So if you're interested in more of my work, you can visit tomleonlynch.com. Or Google around there. I'd also like to provide an opportunity for my colleague, Dr. Hannah Gerber, to do just her own brief hello and introduction, and then we'll get into the substance of today's presentation.
Hi, I'm Hannah Gerber. Hi, I'm Hannah Gerber, and thank you, Tom, and thank you, Yvette, and thank you, everybody, for being here. We're very excited to talk to you today about some ideas that we've been working on recently. But as Yvette said, I primarily research the confluences of learning that happen with adolescents in digital spaces. I look a lot at what happens with the intersections and disjunctures between in-school and out-of-school literacies, or between formal and informal learning. Some of my current research is revolving around the field of, or the esports, which is a video games, competitive video game play, often played in, as this arena you see here, big arenas with tens of thousands of people with prize purses up around $22 million. So it's a huge, huge industry, but there's also grassroots movements that happen within schools, particularly universities and now in high schools. And so some of what I'm tracing and looking at is the way that colleges and universities begin mentorship programs with getting young adolescents and high school and middle school students into the competitive video gaming, and then the way that they make meaning together when they engage in these collaborative mentoring activities. So that's kind of where some of my most recent research is.
That's great. Thanks, Hannah. So moving into the next slide, what we'd like to spend a little time on today is talking about something that Hannah and I have written about recently called the Ontological Imperative. Now, just to make the connection really clear between the title of today's talk, which is Qualitative Research in Computational Times, Dilemmas of Data Gone Digital, and this term ontological imperative, which might strike you as a term out of a philosophy class. One of the things that we want to sort of drive home over the course of this webinar has to do with this tension between these worlds of like what's traditionally thought of as like very kind of quantitative, technological, sort of scientific, empirical the world, and then in this world of like the qualitative. And the more of the subjective and the multiple and things like that. And so as Hannah and I over the last number of years have been thinking and writing and talking about these sorts of things, we started a project a number of months ago in which we were trying to conceptualize it. And the term that emerged as part of that conceptualization was this term, the ontological imperative. And so before proceeding, let me just offer just a quick kind of overview of how we're going to go from here. I'm going to offer just a quick overview of what ontological imperative means, or what we think its meaning, and then I'm going to step back and offer a little bit in terms of my own sort of research and conceptual paradigm, kind of how the ontological imperative kind of plays into to an area that I call critical software studies. Then Hannah's going to share a little bit in a bit greater depth how the ontological imperative is kind of informed by her research paradigm as well. And then we're going to kind of come back to this term and make sure that we have the sort of working definition understood, and we get a sense of what this ontological imperative is and what problem it poses for researchers today. Then, in sort of the second half, we want to share with you what we think are some pretty solid ways to account for this ontological imperative in one's research, and in particular in one's research methodological sections. And then we'll kind of start to conclude things along that vein. If you do have questions that come up, if we start to lose you at any point, we have the chat window as well in front of us. It can be hard to kind of switch gears to go from what we're talking about into the chat, but if there is something that just is completely like you're not sure, or whatever it might be, use exclamation points. Let us know that way, and we'll do our best to keep track. And we'd ask Yvette too if you can keep an eye out for those kinds of not just questions, but things where it's really impeding folks understanding. We'll keep an eye out for that. All right, so this is what we mean, generally speaking, by ontological imperative. What we mean to say, and what we're going to argue over the course of the webinar today, is that when it comes to talking about digital data or digital tools, so when it comes to talking about anything relating to the digital, there's something about the nature of the digital that it's imperative for researchers to account. And what we mean by that nature is we mean that to be digital is to always be, as these birds are in the screen, is kind of always to be moving and to be in flux. That whereas we sometimes like to think that of digital devices or things like this as having a certain kind of stability that we might associate with more traditional forms of data or work that we do or tools that we use in our research. When it comes to anything that's digital, it's actually way more in flux than it might appear at first. And the nature of that flux is something that we hope to make a bit clearer today, and the implications of that flux is something that we hope to make a bit more clearer today. So when we talk about ontological imperative, it's not some sort of kind of Kantian essay that we wrote for fun, but rather we're using those two terms very intentionally, and we hope that it becomes clearer. That having been said, what's informing this? Where is this coming from? And so to speak to that, let me click the slide. Here we go. I want to introduce something to you that I've developed in my work, in particular in a book called The Hidden Role of Software in Educational Research, Policy to Practice. And I refer to it as critical software studies. And so, a number of years ago, I did a lot of work in English education and in social science qualitative research. And as I was doing work around the use of technology in education, both in some of my kind of day job, large-scale online learning kind of programs in New York City, but also in my conceptual work I was doing as part of my doc studies, what I was finding is that there was a massive disconnect between the nature of working with digital technologies and the research that I was finding out there. And so one of the things that I started to feel was that it seemed to me like there might be a bit of an kind of an under-theorization of what the technological actually was that was making its way into research. So I started to do some of my own kind of prying, and I read some of the books that you see up on the screen here. And a lot of these come out of a field that's sometimes referred to as software theory. It's sometimes called software studies. There's also kind of sub-areas like code studies and platform studies. But in general, what the folks on the screen are writing about is they're writing about this notion of software. Like, what is software, practically speaking and conceptually speaking? And software, one of the things that they'll argue is that software is inherently language-based and is linguistic, and just like any language, it's social and it's always in flux. And I don't know about you, but when I've thought about the digital before or things like software, words like language and flux and social were not necessarily the words that came to mind. So I became intrigued with these kinds of books, and I wrote that book. You can see the shameless self-plug there on the bottom of the screen. I wrote my kind of response to having read many of these books. I kind of wrote my response, trying to make that bridge between educational research and software theory. So let me explain just a bit more, in a bit more detail, like what some of the main tenets of software theory are, why it's important when we're thinking about an ontological imperative, mixed methods research, and the use of digital data and digital tools. So in my book, this is a main sort of heuristic that I use to describe the ways in which software theory has implications, particularly for educational research, but I can also share how it relates beyond that. So what you see in front of you is you see kind of these two main spaces on the periphery. So there's the upper space of the political and the economic, and then there's the lower space of the pedagogical and the administrative. What does that really mean? So it's like looking up at the top of the screen. It means that policymakers write policies that have different implications for schools. So when Common Core was kind of passed in the United States, there was a heavy emphasis on new computerized approaches to testing, for instance. So at the school level, which is toward the bottom of the screen, you have this pedagogical space and this administrative space. These policy recommendations and requirements have implications for what's happening on the ground. Increasingly, however, the way in which these policies are operationalized in schools is through what's called software space. And software space refers to what I break down as these like 5 layers of these 5 layers. They intertwine. It would be more accurate to show them intertwining, but I show them as separate just for clarity's sake. And those consist of things like working from the bottom up. It includes devices, network infrastructure, interfaces, code, and information systems. So to make this all very, very kind of practical, policymakers at the top say students have to be tested more often, let's say. At the school level, a building principal and a teacher have to figure out what this means in their classroom, and so they get money usually to buy lots of devices. So they have devices, right? So a student's holding a particular, let's say they're holding an iPad in the classroom. The iPad moving up the next level is connected to a network infrastructure. That is, it's connected to the wireless signal. On the screen of the iPad, the student encounters an interface which has different screenic elements and things that they tap on and they engage with. What you're actually seeing on the screen, the interface is a visual representation of code systems that are at play. And then those code systems, part of what they do, part of what the code does is it communicates in very rapid time with information systems, including things like databases and streams and things like that. So when we're thinking about the use of any sort of like digital technology in schools, it's insufficient just to use the word digital or just to think of it as a tool. It's insufficient to use just the word technology. Those kind of simplistic terms, what they do is they lead to this under-theorizing of what we're actually talking about. And what we're talking about is software. What we're talking about is software space. And the reason that's really important, as Hannah and I will get into a bit more later on, the reason that's really important is because like those devices didn't just appear out of nowhere. Those devices were created by companies, sometimes by individuals, but they were created for specific purposes. And the purposes are usually not just for education or just so kids can learn as best as they can. The network infrastructure, the wireless systems, they are you can't see them; they're invisible, right? And so we don't know what's going on there. What information is actually passing from here to there, and why? Similar with interfaces, the code that's written, the databases, etc. That's a blown up version. I'm not sure why I included it, but there you have it, an even larger version for you. And this is another visual representation that I think can just be helpful to kind of drive this point home a bit, right? So what we experience in our kind of daily lives is we experience, all sorts of things, ranging from TV to conversations with friends and Muppets and all sorts of stuff, Nicki Minaj. And that's kind of what I call above the screen. But what's happening below the screen, or what I sometimes call what's happening in a subscreenic space, is more like what you see below, is more of this sort of, gobbledygook of languages that don't mean much to us. Or to give another quick example in terms of social media, this is a popular English teaching website and community, I should say, that's been in existence for a number of years now. They have tens of thousands of English teachers all over the world. It's called English Companion. And the way in which I might just engage with English Companion would be similar to the way in which one might engage with something like Facebook. But what's happening when you actually engage in a site like this, just like with any of the social media that we engage with, is that actually what's happening is like you're using these kinds of interfaces and devices, you're using these to transmit very, 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 very rapidly. You're transmitting information or data about yourself to sometimes known and sometimes unknown places. So you can actually, there's all sorts of ways that you can use open source software to track this kind of data that's being transmitted. And this is a screenshot of a little experiment I did, where I was looking to see how, when I used Facebook, like what are called data packets, or what are the packets of data that are being transmitted from my computer to Facebook. And this shows you here, right? That these are the actual data packets that get compressed and sent in at the speed of electricity. And so what you can tell is that this data in this case is actually quite is encrypted. You can't read any of it. It's intentionally sort of broken down and made so that it's unreadable to the human eye. And this is what it looks like in the cloud. Another artistic attempt, for which I hope you forgive me. But this is the data that is transmitted from that website, English Companion, that I shared before. So just click back. This is what it looks like when it's encrypted and it's coming from Facebook and I'm using it. This is what digital data looks like. However, the digital data that's being compressed and transmitted over wireless signals to routers and beyond, just essentially server to server, when it's coming from English Companion, it's unencrypted. And the reason that's a concern is because of this the red lettering that you see down there at the bottom, transmitting over my wireless network for anyone to intercept if they have a little spare time and some YouTube videos at their disposal. They can see where I live, they can see who I am, they can see my age, my gender, etc. And so this is just a kind of a brief example of how this kind of software space here in the middle, the way in which it operates, and why it's not enough to say that something is digital. It's not enough to say that it's technology. We have to understand that anything involving the digital, the technological, it's far more complex than that, and it almost always involves software. And with that having been said, I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Hannah.
Hi, thanks, Tom. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a concept that some of my co-authors, colleagues, and I developed when we were co-authoring our book, Conducting Qualitative Research of Learning in Online Spaces. And we were trying to conceptualize, how is it that we can look at the way that users or learners of online technologies are indeed engaged in creation and learning within these spaces, meaning making, so to speak. So what we came up with was this concept of network field sites, which really identifies this dynamic sites of study that are user driven, they're social, they're collaborative. And through network field sites, researchers are able to engage in tracing the way that meaning making happens in and across and through these spaces, these tools, and with participants. And so you kind of see some images here that show the interconnection of multiple users and then the way that these strands and traces of lines are connecting them to other people. And as researchers, we need to think about, well, how are we indeed understanding the ways that people are making meaning in online spaces? And what does that mean? As Tom had said, you've got these technologies that have much deeper things going on at levels that you can't always see. So thinking about ways that we use this concept allows us to really engage in research that moves beyond the surface and beyond just looking at one singular space, but into moving beyond spaces and looking at data that is actually more robust. And so one example that I want to show, and I can talk about a couple, but the one that I really want to show is something that I would say was near and dear to my heart. So as Yvette said, one of my interests is looking at education in the Arab world, especially post-Arab Spring. And in 2016, a doctoral student from Cambridge. He was Italian, but he was getting his PhD from Cambridge. He was doing his dissertation, his doctoral research in Egypt on labor unions. His name was Giulio Ragini. And around the January 25th, the anniversary of the January 25th, 2011 revolution, his body came up. It was missing for 7 days, came up, and there was indications of state-sanctioned torture. And so I thought, well, what's happening in social media around this? You know, what are people saying? What kind of conversations are going on? How is meaning being made, and where is it coming from, and how is it flowing, and what exactly is being said? So I went to Instagram and I used a pre-built tool, which we're going to get into a little bit about some of the limitations. And I pulled the hashtags using the Instagram API around Giulio Ragini, mainly Ragini, and got 322 posts returned. And so what I then began to do is do a visualization where I could understand what kind of themes were coming out of this, and how were people in general making sense of the murder of Giulio Ragini. And so you can see I had 73 discrete hashtags that actually came up from the 322 posts. I drilled into each post, and we're going to go into that in a little bit about how looking at digital data allows you to go deeper than just the surface. I drilled into each post, and I came up with doing some analysis by looking at the visual as well as the comments from the posts. And I was able to come up with these themes that you see here, these 6 themes dealing with human rights, activism and activists, policing, Ragini and education, press and media, and emotions. And so this is just kind of one idea. If we think about the spaces that we are going into as expanding beyond the space itself into other diverse areas, we see that research is more than just saying, okay, I'm going to look at this one person or this one space, but I'm going to look at it somewhat holistically. So I think in a way, when we begin to look beyond the static and begin to think of sites as dynamic and spaces that are really user-driven, social, and collaborative, it gives us a little bit more of an opportunity to dig deeper into the data that we are able to procure from these sites, and then be able to make sense of really what's going on at a greater level. Tom, is it you, or is it no?
Great, thanks, Hannah.
Okay.
Yep. All right, thank you. Okay, so we've introduced this term, the ontological imperative, and now we've shared a little bit about our respective kind of research and conceptual paradigms from which we're coming. So just to reiterate, when we're talking about the ontological imperative, the heart of the concern is that the instability of the digital is something that we're not accounting for sufficiently in our research methods or in the research, and that includes the research tools that we're using as well as digital data that we're collecting. And if we don't account for that instability, then there are dramatic implications for the epistemological kind of moves we can make in our research. So, as we'll get into in a moment, for example, let's say that someone was to collect all sorts of social media data from Instagram, using Hannah's example, right? So let's say Hannah did this fantastic data pull of digital data related to this event, and she conducted her own analysis. And let's say a year later, someone else reads Hannah's study and then says, well, this is fantastic. I wonder, let me try to do this for myself and see, when they might be kind of checking to see maybe Hannah's analyses were spot on. Maybe she could she miss something, or maybe they just want to see if it applies, if they can kind of test it themselves, right? So they go ahead and they try to pull the same data. There are multiple ways in which that person might be unable to collect the same data. And we're going to get into a few of the different reasons that they might not be able to do so. But some of them include the data is made available by a particular company, right? In that case, it would be Instagram. Instagram chooses to make certain kinds of data available in certain kinds of ways. The terms that they set for those data to be accessed can change whenever Instagram wants them to change. They can change for whatever reason Instagram might want them to change. And they don't necessarily have to leave any sort of archival note letting you know that. It's just the terms of service might change. In addition, it could be, let's say, that the actual posts that that were collected for something like the data pull Hannah did, that those posts were pulled down by the actual owners of the accounts, right, for multiple reasons. So I mean, we have seen celebrities and high-ranking political officials in the United States delete their tweets or revise them over time. And a researcher who might be relying on that as data might be getting different kinds of data than they thought. Another just brief example, it could also be that the very tool that you're relying on to collect that kind of data changes, and we'll talk about this in a bit greater depth. But whether you're using a pre-built tool, so it could be, you go to a website, you plug in some information and it pulls the data for you, or if you have some programming chops and you want to kind of call the data yourself, you want to call an API and pull the data yourself, even in those cases, the things change in the digital world, and they might make replicating a study or a data grab, it might make replicating it not just difficult but impossible. And we'll get into this in a bit more detail later on. But to summarize what we've been talking about up to this point, it's to say that when we think about digital data, when we think about digital tools, when we think about technology today, we sometimes think of them as possessing some sort of objective, empirical sort of qualities, right? And in fact, they are constantly in flux, and that flux is something that we as a research community need to get a better grip on. And we think that we have some very concrete ways in which we can start that conversation and perhaps help others begin to do so. So moving forward, there we go. So what are some of these implications for research? So Hannah and I, as part of our recent paper on the ontological imperative, we've posed a series of 5 questions that we suggest that researchers need to account for in their methodology sections. We should also note, especially given the particular audience on this call, that when there's a very compelling argument to be made that research involving digital data or digital tools is inherently mixed methods or multi-methods, or it's inherently involving both the quantitative and the qualitative as well. And that's something that we could speak to more so as part of this talk or afterwards. But there are 5 questions that we think researchers need to consider in their methodology sections whenever they are dealing with digital data or digital tools. Question 1 is, what digital tools, systems, and services are at play in my study? Who created them and why? So in the example of Instagram, Instagram created this, let's say it's Instagram who created the data set in that case, or if you're using a particular tool, who created this? Is it a for-profit company? Is it a team hanging out in a basement somewhere? Is it a nonprofit? Who created this and why did they? It's important to have some social context in terms of understanding who made these particular tool systems and services. Number 2, what data do these digital tools, systems, and services render? So I have a particular tool or a service that I'm using to gather data. What are the data that I'm actually collecting here? And it's important to ask that question critically. Meaning asking a complementary question, which might be like, what data do these digital tool systems and services not render and why? And we'll show some examples of that shortly. Question number 3, what hidden limitations might there be to the data rendered via these digital tools, systems, and services? And that notion of hidden limitations is something to consider. Again, challenging what might be sometimes kind of popular or common sense knowledge, right? That if it's digital, it's technology, it's inherently, empirical, and it just is, we give this sort of omniscient quality to it. The challenging that and looking for these hidden limitations. Number 4, What are the epistemological implications of this ontological analysis? What are the implications for what we can say we now know, the epistemological? What are the implications for that based on what we are saying about the nature of the digital itself? And then number 5, what are the axiological and ethical implications of this ontological analysis? What is it that we can say for notions of fairness, for instance, of ethics, for example? And so we're going to speak to each of these 5 questions now. I believe, Hannah, I think we 1 and 2, I think Hannah will speak to, 3 and 4, I will. Number 5, Hannah will pick it back up, and then we will affectionately interrupt each other as needed or desired throughout. Go ahead, Hannah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. So I want to also, Tom was talking a little bit about, if you think back to the Giulia Ragini example, that was the perfect example that he brought up. If another researcher wanted to come in and take a look at the data that I had pulled to see where my findings, if my findings were indeed accurate or if my findings could be different. And I wanted to do my own kind of pool of the data again to see if the data would still be the same data. And I was unable to pull the same data again because the pre-built tool I used, which we're going to talk about in a minute, actually had been shut down. So we are at the whim also of the commercial entities that often change the API keys that we're allowed to use. And so when we look at this question, what digital tools, systems, and services are at play, who created them, and why, we have to first think about what data is it that we are trying to collect, and what questions are we even trying to answer with the data that we are collecting. So as Tom said, there are multiple levels of being able to be a researcher of digital spaces using digital data and digital methods. And so when we take a look at the idea of tools, systems, and services, tools, we can think about, okay, well, what are the codes or what are the programs that we're using to pull the data? And that's also systems. And then what are the services? Who actually owns the data? Another example is some of my recent research that I'm doing right now is dealing with esports, and we've used the League of Legends API, their developer API, to pull data to be able to look at the players in our study and to see how collaboration indeed impacts teamwork, but how the mentorship impacts that. And we were able to pull data around this study we did this summer, and then all of a sudden Riot shut down that API and they only allowed ranked games to be pulled. And so of course none of our players, because they were novice, were playing in ranked games, so we could no longer pull that data. So it's very unstable. And so when we think about the question tools, I cannot code, I'm not a programmer, so I rely on pre-built tools that allow me to do API pulls of data that I'm interested in from sites that I'm interested in. And one such group who has created tools, now again, we're thinking about the people that create the tools, right? We've got the Digital Methods Initiative, which they're based out of Amsterdam, and they've created over 50 tools that allow people to pull data. And so we have to think about, well, they've created these tools. They had specific uses in mind for these tools, which may not be the same use that I have for the tool. So if I'm wanting to use the Instagram tool to pull data around Giulia Ragini, or my League of Legends, let's use the League of Legends one, to pull data around players who are novice players, and then Riot knows that they can make money, which is a whole nother aspect from keeping that data back. They shut that part down, and all of a sudden now I'm limited to the data that I can grab. And so we really have to think about how are we going about the data? Who's created the tools that let us pull that data, or are we able to pull the data ourselves? So we start to think about then, well, what data are we even being able to grab? And so then you have to look at what's in the developer documentation. So for instance, Twitter, I went to a workshop about a year and a half ago by Queensland University of Technology on digital methods, and they gave us a data set around David Bowie. When his death happened, they started pulling data that moment using something called a streaming API, which pulls data in real time up to a limit. Again, this is part of the complications of digital data is you are at the whim of the companies who are willing to part with their data. And so they were able to pull data continuously over the duration of the time that David Bowie was trending. And so in order for them to do that, they used an API tool that they had from the Digital Methods Initiative called the Twitter Capture and Analysis Tool. And they were pulling continual data. However, the data that were pulled were limited. When you look at this spreadsheet here, this is the Bowie data. You've got geolocation. I think, Tom, what did we say? It was something like 32 lines of data that were pulled, 32 or 39. I can't remember at this moment. But you can see that you've got things such as location. You've got actual geolocation. You've got self-reported location, but actual geolocation. You've got how many times things have been retweeted. You can actually drill in and see the text if you look at column E. You've got the username, which we'll go into when we talk about ethics, the ethics of some of this. You've got the time. When was it posted? If you can't see over more, if you could scroll, you could see that you could actually click on the link that would take you directly to that person's tweet. So you've got very granular level data here, which is then, as you saw in the Ragini one, then it's aggregated and turned into this big visualization. But so you're seeing here what you got from this pool with this particular API, but Twitter has so many more levels of data that weren't made available. So you have to think about, well, this goes into this question, what is it exactly that I'm getting, and is this the data that I need, or is there more data that I need that's not made available by this API key or by this pre-built tool? And so these are some of the questions that we have to ask ourselves, realizing that there is inherently a commercial interest involved in these commercial spaces that people are inhabiting and using. How does that then, as researchers, impact the data that we are trying to get to make sense of the way that people are engaging and learning and meaning making and socializing within these spaces? I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Tom. I'm looking at the time.
Yeah, no, I'm good. Why don't we keep going? And we do have a great question down in the chat box by Li Luan, who asks, if the digital data are always considered in flux, how do we then account for the reliability and validity of the digital data that we study? That's a fantastic question, and our answer to that will be that we have to account for it in our methodology sections, and we'll be sure to return to that question and to some suggestions there at the end of the next 4 steps. Go ahead, Hannah.
Okay. And so I think I'm going to turn it over to you, unless you want to add to those 2 questions.
Oh, no.
But I think, Li Luan's question is absolutely pertinent. And I think that goes into exactly what we're talking about, is that we have to, as researchers, be transparent. And we have to say, okay, this was the call I used. This was the date that I did this data pull. All of these different things. This was the tool I used, or if you did a direct call because you can program, this was the key. This was the key I used, and these were what data were allowed to be returned. And I think that's what you're going to talk about right here, actually, Tom.
That's right. So, so the next question is, what hidden limitations might there be to the data rendered via these digital tools, systems, and services? And the fact is, the data that we're gathering and the systems we're using and the services are thoroughly limited in lots of ways, including some of the examples that Hannah has just shared as well. What we see here on this original spreadsheet might be there were between 30 and 40 fields of data provided, as Hannah had said. But Twitter actually makes available, if you go to their developer documents, what you'll see is that they actually have over 100 fields of data that are available. So in the tool that Hannah was using, the folks who created that tool said, we don't want to, and we don't know, they might have said something like, well, we don't want to overwhelm users with 100 different, checkboxes or fields to consider. So let's take what we think are like the top couple dozen and make those available to users. The result, though, is that you're getting you're getting less than a third of the data that, in theory and technically speaking, you could have access to. And so the only way to see that is by, as Hannah had mentioned, by comparing the data that you're pulling with the data that's available by looking at something like the developer documentation. There was also in writing the ontological imperative article as well, and kind of getting some feedback from some folks in some different industries. I had a friend who works for a large technology company who was also saying that one of the reasons why we make certain data available is one, because it's not profitable for us to keep it, right? So that's one question. We make the data available publicly that we're not necessarily going to make a lot of money off of, but also because from a technical perspective, it's easier to make some data available than other data available. And so there are these different influences that impact and that inherently that limit the kinds of data that you get. This is an example of just when I'm doing a direct call for data without using a third-party tool. This is using the programming language R, and I'm in a tool called R Console, and this is where I do my direct call for data. So it might seem that, well, if you're using like a programming language directly, well then you must have there's like greater stability at least to what you're doing, and the answer is actually like not really, not so much. And there's two places that the flux continues. So one is that there's flux still in the data that are available to be called, right? And that kind of flux exists. That's controlled by the provider of the data, which might be in this case Twitter or Instagram. At the same time, there's flux in the tool that you're using, insofar as it might change, it might shut down, it might get bought out and close. So even in this example here, where I'm using a programming language, an open source programming language and environment called R, the fact is R has updates to it, right? And those updates can change the way it works over time. If you look over in the lower right-hand corner of the screenshot in front of you, you'll also see that, as with many programming languages, you use different kinds of packages or libraries in order to do things faster for specific functionality in the programming language. All of those packages and libraries, they change over time as well. They're language based. Remember, going back to software theory and some of the critical software study stuff, these are all linguistic, and because they're language, it means that they change. So even when you think you might have some greater stability, you don't really. So the goal, in response to our colleague's question in the chat window, it's not necessarily that you can increase the reliability or the stability, let's say, of the data or the tools. What you can do is you can increase your own understanding of where flux exists and what you have to be transparent about when describing your methods to others. Which leads us then into question number 4. What are the epistemological implications of this ontological analysis? Well, some of the epistemological implications here, for example, is that if you're trying to say that you now know things about the way David Bowie trended in Twitter, let's say, for example, it means that you can't state what you think you know so definitively without qualifying it with some of the details of what tools did you use to pull it, what are some of the limitations and affordances of the source of the data that you gathered, and also what we recommend in our ontological imperative paper is we also recommend that researchers try to anticipate what some of the parts of their data collection and their process, their methods, what might change in the future, and anticipate what that might be. So, for example, it could be, I think we even had this experience anecdotally where the terms of service of a particular site kind of changed while we were in the process over a few weeks of looking at it. Well, in that case, you want to acknowledge that in your methodology section. You might want to say that you don't think it has any direct implications in the moment for your findings. However, down the road, it might have a direct implication on replicability, for example. And so these are the kinds of ways that we believe researchers, whether you identify as qualitative or quantitative or mixed, if you're working with digital data or using digital tools, this is more of the way that we have to start thinking about our work. And similar here as well, the kinds of knowledge that can be constructed from the data that are collected, what it is I'm able to say about what I now know is necessarily intertwined with the tool I used to collect it. and the source of it and the kind of ever fluctuating nature of the digital on both sides of that process. And I'm going to transition to Hannah for question number 5, our last question.
Great, thanks, Tom. So ethics within research is one of mine, I guess you'd say, nearest to dearest topics to talk about, particularly when we look at research that happens in online spaces. I serve on my university's IRB, and with that, we get many, protocols that come through that are looking at, or they don't come to us, but they come to the compliance officer first that look at social media. They never make it to the IRB because what happens with research that deals with social media, unless you're actually as a researcher engaged in communicating with the people in these online spaces, let's say you're doing research, Twitter research, it's generally not considered human subjects research. So it doesn't undergo the scrutiny of an IRB. Now, we do get protocols that come forward that deal with people who are engaged in like online discussion boards and that sort of stuff. The second that you turn that to engaging with participants through interviews, research, interactions, it does become human subjects research. But when it is seen as looking at archival data from Twitter, under the federal regulations and the common rule, it's currently not specified as human subjects research, which brings this whole plethora of ethical issues and concerns when we think about what we're doing when we are, pulling data that deals with things people are talking about, because in online spaces, because they, that may not be what they thought was going to happen. They didn't think researchers were going to come in and scrutinize their conversations. I've reviewed articles for journals where you're able to backwards track just because the identity of the person was not concealed. You're able to backwards track exactly where that community was when it's dealing with such scary stuff. So we have to think about these spaces are really become a continuum because they are technically public according to API, the application programming interface, but a lot of people don't think of that. Even with terms of service, when terms of service say we give right for us to use your data, for people to use your data, people don't really read the terms of service. And so we have this idea of a continuum because things that are also once private can be turned public. So a good example is the figment.com, which was an online kind of a fan fiction repository, and they were bought by Random House. Random House then took the reviews, which were private, and publicly indexed them. So all of a sudden, these things that people had that were private have become public. Another example is you may have heard of the Facebook study, not the psychological study, but a study that took place back in 2007 called the Taste, Tease, and Time study, where a group of researchers working with Facebook culled the profiles of 1,700 freshmen and then made this data set publicly available. They de-identified it. They made sure that there weren't the identifying traits, but within 30 minutes, the data set was cracked and people were able to identify down to the freshmen in the university where it took place, which was Harvard. And so that's one of the scary things that we have to think about is even though the whole point of that data set was, and the reason they were able to get access to data, these researchers, was they went through the RA. Well, the RA of these students had different levels of privacy set for these individuals. So they were getting data that they maybe should not have been able to get because of the way the privacy settings were set for the RA, which would have probably been different if, you can set your different privacy levels. So another example is OkCupid. Researchers I think it was 2 summers ago, they used the API, culled the profiles of all the all the OkCupid users and created this database. Well, now you've identified people by sexual orientation, making this database available. Even though they de-identified it, people were still able to identify who these people were. So when you think about all of those lines of data that we showed you with the David Bowie example, it brings us to the question of really we have to ask ourselves some questions. Sorry, these are blurry. I'm not sure why that is, but The next two tables are just some questions that we can ask ourselves. I'm not going to go into them in too much detail. If you are interested, they are in, and as shameless plug, for a book that I co-authored with my mentioned colleagues down there, Conducting Qualitative Research of Learning in Online Spaces. And these are some questions that we can ask where we understand public and private scales, the permission levels to gain entry, exercising caution, are the populations vulnerable, using data encryption. So once we ask ourselves these questions, we can then say, okay, I have this data set. I'm going to write about this data set. How much concealment then do I have to give to my participants? And so we pulled from Amy Bruckman's levels of concealment dealing with online spaces from unconcealed all the way to maximum concealed. And so there's various ways that you can write about the data of your participants, or in the case of if you're doing pure social media research that your university has designated through their IRB compliance officer, it's not human subject research, you still have to exercise ethical concerns with the data that you are using. Some researchers that use API data say all data is public, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody thought that their data were going to be put into a research article that identified, coming out, and they might be somebody who lives in a country where that could lead to penalty of death. There are severe consequences when we're not careful with the data that we are using.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. And so as part of kind of wrapping up, one, we wanted to say thank you and share with you just lots of tweeting birds. But also we think that, if you're interested in sort of exploring some of these ideas a bit further, it can be as simple as just as considering from your own research perspective, like what's a particular digital data set or digital tool that you use. And spend some time with the 5 questions that we've posed and see what they reveal. If you're gathering digital data, click down on the developers link at the bottom of most of these kinds of sites and click through to see what kinds of additional information are given about the amount of data that's available, how it's collected, etc. If you're using a pre-built tool, it can be helpful to read up on who created it and why, and to compare it with other kinds of tools that you see out there in the world and ask yourself, like, why does this tool do something this way and not another way? How might some of these differences be affecting the kinds of analyses that I can conduct? One of the things that we get into in the article, for example, is that many of these tools that we use today, part of what they do is they create very aesthetically pleasing and compelling data visualizations very quickly. But that's a blessing and a curse, because sometimes these visualizations, just because they aesthetically are appealing, doesn't mean that the way in which the data are being analyzed or what it conveys is accurate or is even necessarily helpful. And so these are all new kinds of questions that we have to ask ourselves, and we hope that after hearing a little bit of our work today in terms of considering the ontological imperative, we hope that these are questions that you yourselves can start to pose as you continue your work. So thank you very much for joining us. I don't know if we have too much time, or I'll hand it back over to Yvette in terms of deciding what she'd like to do with the remaining time. But thank you all very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Hannah. That was a great, interesting presentation. If anyone does have questions, we had that one earlier from Lee Duan, but I'm not sure if he touched or answered that completely. If the digital data is always considered a flux, how do we then account for the reliability and validity of the digital data that we study?
I'm sorry, did we answer the question, Liulan?
In the meantime, if anyone else has any questions, you can raise your hand, or you can just start typing below. We do have a few minutes left. Yes, said it was answered, so that's good.
Awesome. I mean, I can, I would like to, I think, mention one other thing then that we touched on just there at the end, and if folks have questions, by all means type them in. But we do draw on some different bodies of work around digital methods and software theory and the digital humanities as well. And we have two particular researchers. I believe it's pronounced Ryder and Roll, though I'm not sure, and I hope to meet them someday so they can admonish me and correct me. But they point out some really, I think, powerful considerations we should make when thinking about digital data. And one is they too talk about what they call this lore of objectivity, and they use this term mechanical optimism, saying that when we think of things like technology or the digital, we have this optimism that just accompanies anything. If it's technological, if it's digital, it has to be progressive, it has to be better, and better means perhaps stable, perhaps whatever. So they too provide some language around some of these things. They also talk about what they refer to as the where is it? The power of visual evidence, and they talk about how visualizations can carry so much argumentative weight despite their reductive character. And they make a very, I think, astute point, which is to say, when visualizations were used kind of historically in research, they tended to be used as a way to analyze data. But today, with the rise of digital visualizations, what we're seeing now is we're seeing visualizations being used increasingly as a way to convey findings in one's data. And they go to some length to say that like those aren't the same things. There's a difference between using it as what they would say is an analytical device versus using visualizations as an epistemic or epistemological device that is something that conveys new knowledge. And I think that too is a very is an excellent insight. The final thing that they mention that we bring up in the article is that they also talk about black boxing, they call it. Black boxing simply means that the kinds of software and technologies that we use are always kind of opaque in certain ways. And that opaqueness is perhaps for good reason, often proprietary. But however, it also means that researchers are never going to know as much as they should or could about the tools that they're using, the data that they're gathering. And we do, at a minimum, we have to do more in our methodology sections to be able to account for what we think we know and what we think we don't know about what we have.
Great, thanks, Tom. So I think that, I think we do have Marcia
I got
Antonio.
it.
Okay.
Yep, I'll put a response there in the bottom. There we go.
So we have one from Azumi. When PowerPoint became a norm for presentation, I felt confined in capturing ideas that were cyclical or dynamic in nature. I do feel that technology has shaped how we were encouraged to think. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of our presentation today. So Tom and Hannah, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Everyone, next month we'll have a presentation from John Hancock and Bonnie Astasi using mixed methods research for culturally relevant program design and evaluation. That's in September, so you can look at the IIQM site, iiqm.ualberta.ca, and we'll have that link up fairly shortly. So Tom, Hannah, any last words for our guest today?
Oh, thank you all for attending. It was such a pleasure and an honor to get to speak with all of you today. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very, very much. And if you'd like to stay in touch, you can follow either of us on Twitter, or you can check out our websites, etc. But we love staying in touch with researchers and graduate students all across the world. So if you would like to stay in touch, please reach out and do so. Don't be bashful.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Take care and have a great day.
Thank you.